That was Liz Truss speaking in Washington a little earlier. Let's get some reaction from Ryan Shorthouse, who is Chief Executive of the think tank Bright Blue. Thank you for joining us tonight. What did you make of what we heard from Liz Truss?
Well, I think, to be honest, considering what happened in the mini-budget, I think it was quite short-sighted of her, considering the economic effects of her mini-budget in terms of raising interest rates and mortgage rates and the cost of borrowing quite considerably, were all a kind of product of that mini-budget. So I think it's kind of short-sighted to see that. But on the broader picture, I would say this. The increase in state spending and taxation that we've seen in recent decades is largely a product of greater demand for healthcare, for pensions, an ageing population. There are kind of structural things that are happening in our economy and society which have necessitated higher levels of spending and, as a result of that, high levels of taxation. So I don't think it's right to necessarily blame a woke culture or a dependency culture on the demand for government services. I think a lot of it is down to structural changes, for example, an ageing population.
She clearly thinks that this is playing well to a certain audience, isn't it? I mean, she said we've got a bailout culture now following on from the banking crisis of 2008 and COVID. I think that might not necessarily land very well with people who needed furlough money during COVID.
Yeah, I mean, the furlough scheme was, it was a similar scheme in other countries. It was highly successful in retaining jobs, and there's been lots of economic forecasts which have said that if a similar income protection or job protection scheme was not in place, then the economic effects would have been much worse. So look, government has a role to play during times of crises, but of course we have to have a smart state, and it's not always about increasing the amount of spending that's into government services. It's also about reforming those government services to make them more responsive and modern. So I think she's right about that. I think also she's perhaps right about the weight of taxation. So, at the moment, because inflation is still relatively high, then having massive tax cuts, unfunded tax cuts, which is what she proposed, is probably not something that's economically desirable. In fact, it wasn't economically desirable when she tried it last year. But I think it's right to think about shifting the weight of taxation away from work, where the tax burden is very high on things like income tax and national insurance, onto income that derives from assets like pensions, like housing, like dividends. I think we should be looking at shifting the weight of lowering the burden of taxation away from work onto wealth. That, for me, would be a fair agenda, but also one which is economically efficient, because work should be rewarded, but also lower taxes can also create greater incentives for economic productivity.
And just finally, her intervention today would seem to indicate that there is lots of different factions in the Conservative Party all competing at the moment. It's turning into a bit of a bun fight, isn't it?
Well, I mean, the Conservative Party has to have a majority of the country. It has to represent different factions. So, the MPs are in different groupings, and that's just reflective of the diversity of opinion within the public. And I think it's healthy to a certain extent to have a battle of ideas within the centre-right movement. What is not healthy is when we're just getting kind of blocked legislation, so the government can't do anything substantial and reforming and major because their own side is blocking it. And, we've seen that a little bit, for example, with planning reform. Late last year, the government was having mandatory national planning targets, house building targets, and they had to be scrapped because of the rebellion on the Tory backbenchers. But equally, this year, we've seen some more radical moves. For example, the Northern Ireland deal, the Windsor Agreement that Sunak brought forward, and then the budget had quite a substantial expansion of childcare provision. So, that shows that actually the government can function even with the kind of ideological differences that exist. So, what I would say is that there has to be a battle of ideas. It's healthy for a governing party to have that, as long as fundamentally the government is able to introduce substantial legislative reforms. And it seems that Sunak is being able to do that a little bit more this year.
Ryan Shorthouse from the Bright Blue think tank. Thank you for joining us.